Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit a pullover sweater on your Addi knitting machine. So the first thing you're going to need is the written instructions that I have on my website, and basically the method of making and assembling all the pieces are going to be in the video, but to actually make it, you're going to need the sizing information and the dimensions to make each piece, because you can make this in any size you want, and I can't possibly give you exact, precise, row by row instructions for every single size you could possibly want to make. So if you click the link in the description box and visit my blog, you will find all of the information that you need to get started with this project. Now, the instructions on my site are not a pattern as such. They are more what you would call a recipe, or kind of an approximate, guidelines to follow, because there are so many possible ways that you could change this. You could use a different yarn at a different gauge, different cut of the sweater, a different fit. Some people like it more fitted, some people want a looser fit. So you could change this in so many possible ways that I can't give you exact instructions for every possible sweater that you can make with this method. So basically what I have in my written instructions is kind of an approximate guidelines for how you can make this sweater on your Addi knitting machine. So I am going to add some stripes to my sweater. This is one of my panels that I've already made, and I'm going to show you how to do this in just a minute. But if you want to add the stripes, I have a separate video on that. So if you want stripes on your sweater, then you can go watch that video. But this video is just showing how to make the sweater itself. So what you're going to need for this project besides the instructions is the Addi knitting machine. If you have an Innovations knitting machine, then you could also use that as well, because that is only about two needles less than the Addi King. The Addi Pro is going to be very, very small for this. So unless you're making a super tiny sweater, or unless you want to join a whole bunch of panels together, ideally you need to do this on the Addi King. So the yarn I'm using is a chunky weight, or a number 5 bulky, and this is Big Twist yarns from Joann. And I'm using the Sea Breeze colorway and the Dove Gray. You'll also need a yarn needle, scissors. You also need a measuring tape, a few stitch markers, not quite this many, but I just have the whole package here. You're going to need a crochet hook. This is an I, size 5.5 millimeter. And you will also need a loom pick. So I'm going to start by making the front/back panel. There are two panels that are done exactly the same way, one for the front and one for the back. Now I just want to note here that for basically all adult sizes, depending on your yarn, for at least most, if not all adult sizes, you're going to need to put more than one flat panel together to make your front and the back of your sweater wide enough. If you're doing a child-sized sweater, then one panel for the front and one panel for the back might work depending on the size that you're doing. And some of the smaller child-sized sweaters, you will need a panel that is less than the width of your machine. So the instructions give lots of information on how to customize the sweater, how to determine how many stitches to cast on, and how many panels you're going to need to put together if you're making an adult size. But one thing that I don't recommend changing about this sweater is the ribbing at the bottom of the hem of the sweater and on the sleeve cuffs. And you can change how much ribbing, how wide or how narrow it is, but I do highly recommend doing at least a few rows of ribbing, because if you don't, then your edges are going to curl quite a bit and you're going to lose some of the length. So if you don't want to do any ribbing at all, you could just let the edges curl and then have, some extra length, make it longer than you need, and then let it curl up. But I highly recommend the ribbing, as it really isn't that hard to do, and it gives a very finished, clean, professional look to your work. So we're going to start by casting on. I'm going to leave a very long tail because we're going to do a long tail cast on by making a slip knot, and I'm going to place it on the first white needle. Now, with the yarn that I'm using and the size I'm making kind of what you might call a women's extra small, and it is a snug fitting, close fitting type of sweater. So I can still get my entire front panel and my entire back panel out of one flat panel on the Addi. So I'm going to be showing you how I make that panel. But again, the method is going to be the same if you're making a larger size and you're going to need to put multiple panels together. We're just going to be making the same panel several times and then putting them together for those larger sizes. So I'm going to place the slip knot on my first white needle, and I'm going to kind of sink that white needle down. And then I'm just going to cast on all the white needles with a long tail cast on. And if you want to learn how to do this, if you've never done this before, then you can go and watch my video on how to do a long tail cast on your Addi knitting machine. Alright, so I've finished with my long tail cast on. I have some of my tail left, and this is the working yarn that's coming from my skein. So I'm going to put this into the yarn guide, and I've decided for my sweater that I'm going to have 10 rows of ribbing along the bottom of my sweater and along the bottom of my sleeve cuffs. So I'm going to knit 10 rows, and then I'm going to turn them into ribbing or work ribbing through them. I do have a separate video on that if you want to go and watch that full tutorial. Alright, so there are my 10 rows for the ribbing, and now I'm going to work them into ribbing, as you can see demonstrated in my how to knit ribbing on your Addi knitting machine video. And I'm going to do this as I move across the next row. Alright, so I have finished with my ribbing, and the row that I worked the ribbing on is going to count as my 11th row. So you're just going to keep knitting back and forth in regular stockinette stitch, the stitch that the Addi makes all by itself, until you have total, including your ribbing rows, the total length that you need for the back or front of the pullover, because both panels are the same. But basically, it's just going to be the measurement from the most prominent bone at the base of your neck down to the length where you want your finished sweater to fall. So just keep knitting back and forth until you have the correct number of rows to reach that length. Alright, so I have knit my panel to the length that my sweater needs to be for my front panel and my back panel. And again, all of this information you will be able to get from my website. So now what I'm going to do is pick up all of the stitches on my panel onto a length of waste yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my blue yarn from my other stripe and leave a tail long enough to pick up the entire width of my panel. Now, if you're not doing stripes, then you can just use a separate length of waste yarn, preferably in a different color because that makes it a little easier to work with. And I've also cut my working yarn, leaving a very long tail that is at least 3 times as long as your panel is wide. So I'm going to remove my working yarn from the yarn guide and just hold it out of the way. And then I'm going to thread my extra yarn, or my waste yarn, through my yarn needle. And I really like a bent-tipped yarn needle for this task, for picking up stitches off of the machine. The Addi actually comes with a plastic yarn needle that has a bent tip, but all plastic yarn needles will eventually break. So I really like the metal ones if you have a metal one. They last a whole lot longer, and I think you get a little bit more precision because it does not bend. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up all the stitches from this panel off of my machine all the way across. Alright, so there is my finished panel. So as you can see, the panel looks a lot narrower than it actually is because it curls so much on the sides. But this is my front or back panel. They're both going to be exactly the same. And I already have the second one made. So the next thing I'm going to have to show you how to do is the sleeve panel. So the sleeve panel is a little bit hard to see in this case because it curls so much you can't really, see how it is laid flat. We're going to try to lay it flat anyway. But the sleeve panel is just a regular flat panel, but it's tapered. It starts narrower at the bottom, and then it gets wider as you go up to the top. And it also curls at the top across the place where I've picked up all the stitches. So I'm going to show you how I make the second sleeve panel. They're both going to be exactly the same. The math in the fill in the blanks chart is relatively simple for this. Basically, all you have to do is just fill in the blanks of your measurements and your numbers and the stitch counts that the instructions will tell you how to determine the stitch counts. And basically what you have to do is take the number of stitches you're going to have at the bottom around the wrist and the number of stitches you're going to have at the top around the armhole, because when we assemble this is going to be the armhole of the sleeve, like this. Here's the armhole and down here is the wrist, and it looks narrower than it really is because it's curled up. But basically what we're going to need to be calculating is how many stitches we need to increase to get from this width to this width. And this is not super complicated math or anything. It's just like add, subtract, multiply, and divide kind of math. And the instructions will walk you through every single step that you need to do to figure out how many stitches you're going to need to add from the wrist to the top. So for the size panel that I'm making, I'm going to need to add 2 stitches, 1 stitch at each end, for every 8th row. So what that means is I like to have my increases on, both ends of the row that I'm doing them on. So for my increased row, I will be doing an increased stitch at the beginning and an increased stitch at the end. So we'll add 2 stitches total, 1 at each end. So I need to do a row with 1 increase at each end for every 8th row. So I'm going to do 7 regular rows, and then the 8th row will have an increased stitch at each end. And here is what the increase looks like right here. You can see here's 1 stitch, and then it kind of splits off into 2 on the next row. And if you don't know how to do this yet, you can go and watch my how to work increases on your Addi video. So I'm going to start with my gray yarn and work the ribbing at the bottom, the cuff. And so I'm going to be doing 10 rows of ribbing as I did on the first one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring up the first white needle, and I'm going to start again with a long tail cast on, and I'm going to cast on the number of stitches that I've determined I need to start with for the cuff of my sleeve. Alright, so I have cast on the number of stitches that I need, and I also want to mention that when you do your long tail cast on, you want to leave enough extra length in your long tail so that you'll be able to seam the sleeve seam of your sweater. So you're going to want to leave enough length of your long tail. Now this will get longer as we, when we go back and tighten up the cast on. If you've seen my long tail cast on video, then you'll know what I'm talking about. But the length of our extra tail needs to be the length from the wrist all the way to the underarm to make sure that you have enough seaming yarn, so to speak, to sew up the sleeve seam of your sweater. But you also want to leave an extra 8 to 10 inches past that. So from the wrist to the underarm plus 8 to 10 extra inches. So here's my working yarn. I'm going to put it back into the yarn guide, and I'm going to clear my row counter. Now, it's not necessarily going to matter a whole lot because when you're going back and forth and you do not have the full width of your panel, your panel does not extend all the way around the entire machine, your row counter is not going to count correctly anyway because you won't be making it all the way back around to the other side of the black needles to click that row counter up another number. So because we are going to be kind of doing, you know, increases every so many rows, that's how you're going to want to count. Because first of all, when you work out your fill in the blanks chart, you will know how many rows you need to knit total for your sleeve, and you'll also know how many stitches that you're going to need to increase and how many, you know, how many rows between increased rows. So for my sleeve, I need to knit my ribbing first before I start increasing. So I am going to knit 10 rows of ribbing just like I did on my body panels, the front and the back panels. And the chart allows for you to do as many rows of ribbing as you want. So I'm going to do 10 rows. So I'm just going to knit back and forth for 10 rows and then rib those 10 rows as is demonstrated in my ribbing video. Alright, so I have worked my first 10 rows. And now I'm going to work my row where I work across and do all the stitches so that they turn into ribbing. You can go watch my how to make ribbing on your Addi video if you want to learn how to do that. But I'm going to be, you know, just as we normally would, dropping every other stitch and then picking it up backwards with a crochet hook. And as I go across and do that, I will be, you know, it will be pulling new stitches through to knit the row as I work across the already done stitches that I'm going to make into my ribbing. So that's going to count as my first row. You know, the ribbing in the fill in the blanks chart, the ribbing is counted separately from the rows that are going to be, you know, increased in between so many rows. So the ribbing is first, and then we're going to begin my, you know, my sweater needs to have 2 stitches increased every 8th row. So this first row, as I'm going to do the ribbing, is going to count as the first of my first set of 8 rows. Alright, so I've come across the first row of the stockinette part, or the main section of the sleeve, where I have gone across and worked all of my ribbing columns. So I am going to count that first pass as my first row out of my set of 8, because remember, I'm putting my increases on every 8th row for my particular sweater. And as you can see with my stripe pattern, if you want to learn how to do the stripes, then you can go and watch my previous video on how to do stripes on a flat panel on your Addi knitting machine, and that will show you how I did this particular stripe sequence. But I'm doing 4 rows of the mint seafoam color to every 8 rows of the gray. And after my ribbing, I did 4 rows of the gray before starting that. So I did my first row of the gray. I'm going to do 3 more rows. And now I'm going to start working with my second color, which is my seafoam green. And I'm going to count, since I just did a total of 4 rows of the gray, this is going to be my 5th row in my increase set here, my set of rows before the increase. There's my 6th row. And again, because I'm doing this on the 8th rows, every 8th row, I'm going to knit across for a 7th row and then do my increases on the return pass, or the 8th row coming back. So that was my 7th row. Now here's my 8th row, and because I'm doing the increases on every 8th row for my particular sweater, again, it will be different depending on your sweater, I'm going to take my loom pick and work an increase right here between the first and second stitches. So if you want more detail on how I'm about to do this, you can go watch my separate video on how to do increases. But I'm going to take the yarn out of the yarn guide for just a second and lift the edge stitch off of its needle, bring it over to the next empty needle, and kind of sink that needle a little bit. And I'm going to give the yarn a tug to kind of try to tighten that stitch because it is very large. And then I'm going to come over here and pick up the strand that's on the back of the next needle over. And as I bring my blank or empty needle down, I'm going to take this strand. I'm going to insert my crochet hook into that from front to back, pick up my working yarn to make a loop, and place that over the empty needle. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this really long loop that's on the edge and kind of give a little tug on the side of the loop I just created to kind of even that out. Then I'm going to put the yarn back in the yarn guide that has increased 1 stitch, and I'm going to knit across until I get to the last couple stitches on the other edge, which is these two right here. So I'm going to take this edge stitch over here, lift it off of its needle, and bring up the next empty needle and kind of slide that over the top. This can be a little bit tricky, but you just have to be gentle with it and just work it into place and make sure that you push the knitting down below the red tabs. I'm going to make sure that my working yarn is caught in that last needle that had a stitch on it besides the blank empty needle and the edge stitch needle. Then I'm going to pick up the last horizontal strand that was on the back of that needle and grab the working yarn with my hook and create a new loop to put onto the empty needle. And then I can just insert my working yarn under the hook of that edge stitch needle to create the last stitch. So that is my kind of my increase repeat sequence. And of course I'm going to just continue working my panel in putting those 2 increases on the edge of every 8th row, and then I will show you what it looks like when I am ready to take it off the machine and my panel is the correct width and length and has the correct number of stitches for the sweater that I'm making. Alright, so I have finished my sleeve panel. It is the width and the length that I need it to be. Now, since I ended with my seafoam color, I've left a very long tail, at least 3 times the width of the panel long, before cutting the yarn, and I'm going to bind off with this yarn because this is the last, the color of the last row. If you're not doing any stripes, then don't even worry about that. You're just going to leave a tail that is 3 times the length that your panel is wide when it's off the machine. So you're just going to kind of approximately go like this and lay it around like that, and then just triple that length. And then I've also cut my gray yarn because this is the yarn I'm going to be picking up my stitches with and holding them with, because this was not the color of the last row that I knit. So this just has to be a little bit longer than the width of the panel. So I'm going to thread my gray tail through my yarn needle, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick up all the stitches of this panel onto this strand of yarn. If you are not making stripes, then again, use just a length of waste yarn, but you just want to pick up all the stitches all the way across to get the panel off the machine. And I also want to mention, I forgot to mention this earlier, but when you're knitting your sleeve panel, you may need to knit more than 1 panel to get to the correct width that you're going to need. And in that case, you would knit 2 separate panels and increase only on one side of the one panel and on one side of the other panel. And the other thing that you need to remember is that when you're knitting your sleeve panel, regardless of whether you're knitting 1 panel or more than 1 panel for your sleeve, you're going to need your machine to be in circular knitting mode, because as you increase, your stitches are going to creep over across the black needles onto some more of the white needles, just like mine did. My panel was all around here, and it continued to, as you increase stitches, you need more of those needles. So you will actually be using the black needles, and you won't want it to stop you from moving the machine past the black needles in plain knitting mode or flat panel mode. So you're going to need to have your machine in circular mode. Alright, so there is our sleeve panel, and now we just need to assemble the sweater. Alright, so first we're going to start with our front and back panels. These are exactly the same, and I have a lot of length in tail yarn sitting here. But these are the panels that we're going to assemble first. So the first thing you're going to need to do is, I've already done it on the one panel, but on the second one, I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. We're going to tighten up our long tail cast on. And to do this, we're going to go to the end that is opposite of where the tail is coming from. And we're going to start pulling the slack out of the loopy edge here by taking each individual strand that's next and kind of pulling on it to get some of the slack out. And as we go across, we're going to collect more and more slack in what we're pulling, and that extra slack will come out into our tail yarn. And what this does is it neatens up the edge of the long tail cast on. If you're familiar with the Addi machine, then you probably know that when you're knitting across a row with the Addi holds the knitting very much stretched out widthwise. And so when you cast on to the Addi with a permanent cast on like a long tail, then it ends up being very loose and loopy across the cast on edge. So we fix that when we're finished with our panels by tightening up the cast on edge like I'm doing right now. We're just kind of pulling on each next loop to take the slack out of the one before it. And you don't want this to be like so tight that it doesn't stretch anymore. You want it to have a good amount of stretch in it. We just don't want it to be kind of sloppy and loopy like it is over here. Alright, so now I'm to the last loop. And you're just going to want to pull on your cast on tail to just get rid of that last bit of the slack in the length. And you're going to need to do that to all of your panels to tighten up the cast on edge where we put the ribbing so that it is nice and neat and straight. Alright, so I have my two panels here. One is for the front and one is for the back of my pullover. So what we're going to do is bind off across the top of the panels, because right now all we have is live stitches held on a piece of waste yarn, and that is not a finished edge. So we're going to join the shoulder seams and bind off around the neck at the same time, kind of in one step. And the first thing we're going to do is lay one panel on top of the other one with the right sides, or the nice sides, up against each other, like so, so that we can sew them together from the wrong side, or join them together, I should say. So if you look at what I have over here, this is my right side. If you're a lefty, you can start from the other side. It doesn't really matter. But what I have here is on the one side, on the front panel, I have my super long yarn tail coming off of that. And on the back panel, I just have the waste yarn that's holding all those stitches on the back panel. So we're going to join together for the first so many stitches, and then we're going to bind off the front of the neck edge. And then we're going to do the same thing from the other side to do the back neck and the other shoulder seam. So what we're going to do is kind of the equivalent of a 3-needle bind off if you are familiar with hand knitting. But this is kind of a bind off with a crochet hook method. If you want to see how I do that in more detail, you can go and watch my video on how to bind off with a crochet hook. But what we're going to do is, as you can see, all of our live stitches are held on waste yarn. So I'm taking the front panel and the back panel with the right sides together, and we're going to be binding off with a crochet hook, but we're going to be binding off through both layers. So what that means is I'm going to insert my crochet hook into the first stitch that is on the waste yarn for the front panel and into the first stitch that's on the waste yarn from the back panel. And then I'm going to pick up that tail yarn and slip stitch through both of those stitches. And when I say that, that means you're going to wrap the yarn around your hook and pull that yarn through both stitches that you inserted into. So again, I'm going to insert into the first stitch on the waste yarn from the front panel and into the first stitch on the waste yarn from the back panel and pull the working yarn through all of those, or slip stitch through all of those. Again, insert into the next stitch on the waste yarn for the front panel and in the next stitch on the waste yarn for the back panel, slip stitch through all of those. So I'm going to do this for a total of 12 stitches for my shoulder seam. However, this is going to vary depending on your sweater, what size you're making, and all of that. So I recommend that you pin it together at the top and put it over your head and try it out, see how you want the width of the neck opening to be, because however wide you want your neck opening, whatever's left on each side is going to be your shoulder seams. So I've already pinned it together and tried it on, and I have determined that I need 12 stitches on each side for my shoulder seams, and then the rest of the stitches in the middle are going to be for the neck opening. So I'm going to continue slip stitching both of these layers together as I bind them off until I have gone through a total of 12 pairs of stitches. Pairs meaning the front stitch and the back stitch, one from each panel. Alright, so I have gone across the first 12 pairs of stitches, and now I'm going to leave this back panel alone and going to bind off just the stitches on the neck edge until I have 12 stitches left on the other side of my front panel. But we cannot bind this off in the same way that we did the shoulder seams, because this type of bind off does not have a whole lot of stretch in it. Now that's fine and actually better for the shoulder seams, because we don't want them to stretch too much because they will start to sag and get stretched out. But for the neck edge, you do need it to be able to stretch to make sure you can get it over your head, especially if it's a closer fitting neck hole. So we're going to do a little bit different version of this bind off for the neck opening. And to do this, before I insert into the next stitch on the waste yarn, I'm going to yarn over. Then insert into the next stitch on the waste yarn, and then pull through all of those loops. So I'm going to yarn over, insert into the next stitch on the waste yarn, then wrap the yarn around the hook and pull through all of those loops. So if you are familiar with crochet, you will find this very similar to a half double crochet, because that is kind of the same thing. Alright, so I now have 12 stitches left for the other shoulder seam, and I'm going to kind of temporarily tie off here by pulling the remaining yarn through the loop on my hook, but leaving it kind of loose. And then we're going to kind of repeat the same thing we just did on the other side. So I'm going to flip this whole thing over, and we're going to start doing the exact same thing that we did on the first half on this side. So again, now the panel that was my back panel previously is now in the front. So now I can stack these two together and bind off both layers together for the first 12 stitches with the regular crochet hook bind off. And then once I have finished the 12 stitches for the shoulder seam with the regular crochet hook bind off, I'm going to go ahead and do the stretchy yarn over crochet hook bind off across the remaining neck edge stitches. Alright, so I've worked across all the stitches that were left for the neck edge, and I'm going to work a slip stitch down here where all these edges come together at the shoulder seam, and then I can tie off. And then I can kind of do the same thing on the other neck edge where we had temporarily tied off. I'm just going to undo that little knot and insert my hook back into the loop, and then make a slip stitch into the area where all those edges come together at the shoulder seam. And then I can tie off, and we can weave in those ends. All right, so that is our finished neck hole and shoulder seams. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the ends of the waist yarn that is holding all of the stitches that we already took care of and bound off. We're going to go to the opposite side. Here's the end of the one from this panel, so I'm going to come to the other side and pull it out of all those live stitches. And the same thing with this one. Here's the end of the other one. So I'm going to come to the opposite side and pull it out of these stitches. Like so. So now once we kind of stretch this out and spread it out, you can see what a neat and tidy little seam that makes with the 3-needle bind off or the crochet bind off through both layers. Alright, so here is the body of our sweater. It is still very curled up. Anyway, here's the neck hole, and you just want to make sure that it has a decent amount of stretch in it because you do have to get this over your head. Now, if you're doing kind of a wider, more open neck type of sweater where it has like a boat neck or like even a really wide, you know, kind of off the shoulder, slouchy kind of sweater, then you won't have any problem with that. But you just need to make sure that you have enough stretch in your neck hole if it's going to be a closer fitting neck hole. So these are going to be our side seams and where our sleeves attach. So we're going to go ahead and attach the sleeves now, but we're going to do them one at a time. And to do this, we're going to open up the sweater so that the neck hole is in the center. And here is our shoulder seam. The shoulder seam is going to be the center of where we line up our sleeve to attach it. Now, because my sleeves ended with the seafoam green stripe, that's the yarn that I'm going to be using to attach this to the sweater. So I'm going to be using the tail yarn from my sleeve to do this, and all the stitches from my sleeve are held on this gray waist yarn. So what you're going to do is count all your stitches, you know, across to find the center stitch on your sleeve panel at the top. Now, if you have an even number of stitches, then, you know, you don't have to divide it where that you have one in the center and then an equal number on each side. Just divide the number of stitches in half and find the halfway point. So here is my center stitch right here. And I'm just going to use some stitch markers to kind of pin this together for the moment. So here is the center stitch, or again, if you have an even number, then you would have, you know, this would be like your halfway point, and then you'd have one stitch on each side of the center line. But because this is my center stitch, I'm going to kind of pin it directly to the line that your shoulder seam is on. And that's going to be how we line it up. So what we're going to do to determine how, you know, how far down to stitch our sleeve to the body of the sweater is we're just kind of going to flatten it out, make sure that it's straight. And you also want to kind of go by the armhole depth that you set for your sweater in your original numbers that you started with. So I'm going to kind of pin it together with the stitch marker at where approximately it looks like it would be if it was just laying flat. I think it is shrunk up a little bit right now. So I had set for a 7-inch armhole depth, and this is just about right. So I'm going to go ahead and count the number of rows from the center mark that we had pinned earlier to the place where I pinned my last stitch to. So this is the last stitch of the panel on this side, and it is pinned to this stitch right here. So I'm going to count from this center line the same number of rows in the other direction and pin the last stitch on this side of the panel to that row. Alright, so now my sleeve is evenly spaced and I can stitch it to the sweater knowing that it's actually going to line up correctly and not be crooked. So I'm going to start attaching this from the side that the tail is on. I have quite a long tail for this. This other tail is just from my body panel. So I'm going to move that out of the way for now. So what we're going to be doing is mattress stitching the sleeve to the body of the sweater. And it is kind of curled up right now, but this is kind of how it's going to go together when we stitch it. And this is also curled up as well. So it always is going to look smaller than it actually is because everything curls naturally. So what I'm going to do is I know which row that my stitch marker is in. So I'm going to take the marker out for the moment and just keep my finger on that row. So this very first stitch right here that has the waste yarn running through it, I'm going to come up through that stitch with my yarn needle and the tail that is coming out of that stitch, like so. Then I'm going to come over here and pick up, if you ever mattress stitched before, then this should be familiar to you. If you haven't, you can go watch my video on how to do mattress stitch. But I am coming in a half of a stitch column in from the edge. If you want, you can do a whole stitch column, which is what is allowed for in the pattern, but I'm just going to do a half. It will give a slightly less bulky seam this way. But a one stitch column in is still going to give you very little bulk in the seam. So basically what I've done is I have inserted into my fabric here. I've basically gone under 2 horizontal strands in this half a stitch column in. Now normally you would just go in a whole stitch column and pick up, you know, these 2 horizontal strands, which is a little bit easier to see if you've never done mattress stitch before, which is why I recommend doing that. But this is basically what it should look like. You're going to be following the exact same line between those 2 columns of stitches all the way across your entire seam. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to move over half of a stitch column like that. And then I'm going to bring it kind of closer like that and bring my needle back down through the original sleeve stitch that I had just come out of. And up through the next stitch in the sleeve panel. So then I'm going to come up to the next part of my edge right here and insert in between those same 2 columns and pick up 2 more horizontal strands. And then come back down through the same stitch that I just came out of and up through the next one, like so. And when we pull that taut, you'll be able to see once we take out the waste yarn how neat and clean and seamless or professional looking that ends up being. So I'm again going to come to the sleeve panel and insert my needle in the same place that it came out of before and go up under the next 2 horizontal strands between those columns. And then down back through the sleeve stitch that I was just in and up through the next one. And you always want to make sure that you're not splitting the waste yarn that runs through these stitches, because if you do, then it's going to get stuck when you try to pull it out. And you can, you know, cut it out and it won't really be much of a problem, but it's just a lot easier if you don't split it. So again, I'm coming back to the sleeve panel and inserting between those 2 columns and picking up 2 horizontal strands. And then coming back down through the stitch on the sleeve that I was just in. And again, I'm coming up through the next stitch from the sleeve. I'm going to pick up 2 more horizontal strands between those 2 stitch columns on the body of the sweater, and then back down through the stitch I was just in. And then up through the next stitch. Now you want to kind of keep the yarn tight. You don't want loose loops of stitches here, because you're going to end up with kind of the equivalent of another relatively sloppy looking row of knitting if you don't pull this and make it tight. Now it still is going to have some give in it just because of the structure of the knitting, but you want to make sure that you pinch the beginning of your seam and pull on your yarn to make sure that it is kind of taut. So I'm just going to keep doing this all the way up until I get to the marker that holds my center of the sleeve in place. Alright, so this is going to be my last stitch. And if you do need to fudge just a tiny bit when you get to your center mark, it's okay if you only grab 1 strand from the body panel, or even 3 if you have to kind of just make it line up correctly. So again, I'm going to come down into the stitch that I just came out of, which was the last one before my marker. Then I can take the marker out and come up through the stitch that my marker was in. So again, I'm going to take this stitch, because I had lined it up with the shoulder seam, I am kind of taking the stitch through the shoulder seam. And as you can see, this is what our seam is going to look like, but it's going to look even better once we take out this waste yarn. So now I'm going to do the same thing to get to my next marker. And it's very simple to line up your sleeve correctly. You just need to leave basically 2 rows of the body panel for every 1 stitch in your sleeve panel. So I'm just going to continue stitching everything together the same way that I've been doing, all the way up until I get to the other edge of my sleeve where my marker is. Alright, so I've finished my seam all the way across to the other side of my sleeve, and now we're just going to remove the waste yarn that is holding the stitches that used to be live stitches. So I'm going to grab it from the opposite end and just pull it out completely. And now we can see how neat and clean our seam looks. So that is how we're attaching the sleeves. If you prefer, you can bind off your sleeve with a crochet hook first and then mattress stitch it on, but I much prefer doing it all in one step, and you end up with less bulk in the seam anyway when you do it this way. So now I'm going to weave in this tail, and because my waste yarn is attached to the sleeve because it is the extra tail yarn from my second color on my stripes, I'm going to weave it in as well. But if you're not doing stripes, you don't have to worry about that. Your waste yarn will be separate and you can just pull it out and set it to the side. So once I weave in my tails, then we'll have the sleeve completely done with this step. It'll be attached, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side with the second sleeve. Alright, so my sweater has 2 sleeves now, and now we're going to sew the side seams. So to do this, we're going to take the sweater at the shoulders and pick it up and lay it down so that the front and back main panels, the front panel and the back panel, are stacked on top of each other. We're going to come down here and line up the 2 ribbing edges, like so. And I'm going to kind of rotate it a little bit so you can see both edges at once. And we're going to mattress stitch these 2 edges together as well. So here's my cast on tail. It is quite long. And we are going to use the yarn needle to mattress stitch this side seam edge to this one. And to do this, again, if you want to go watch my mattress stitch video, you might want to do that first if you've never done this before. But I'm going to take a stitch across into the cast on edge of the opposite panel just to line up those edges and make sure that they are totally secure and that they are going to hang evenly and not be like offset in either direction. So like I said, I am taking a half stitch column in my mattress stitch seam, but if you're going to do a whole stitch column, then you definitely need to do that and keep it consistent through your whole sweater. Because if we don't, then by the time we get up here to where the body panels come together and meet the sleeve, the underarm right here, then if we were to do a half stitch here and then a whole stitch here, then it would not quite match up. And that's not the end of the world. It's a very small detail, but I kind of prefer to just make sure everything looks consistent. So again, I'm only going to take a half stitch in my seam, but if you're taking a whole stitch for your sleeve seam, then you'll want to take a whole stitch here. The instructions allow for a whole stitch on each side. So you're going to go to the opposite side of the panel and pick up those 2 horizontal strands in between the columns that you are working between, whether it be the first and second or, you know, one half of the first and the other half of the first. So then I'm going to come back over here and go in between those 2 columns and pick up the 2 horizontal strands. You always want to do this with your needle pointing away from you if you're seaming in that direction. Just keep your needle always pointing the direction that you're working the seam. So now I'm going to come back over here to the other side and pick up 2 more horizontal strands in between those columns. And again on this side, we're just going back and forth in between and picking up those horizontal strands in the middle of each of the columns that we are stitching between. Now, one thing that I did not mention earlier is if your total number of stitches across the front panel is even and your total number of stitches across the back panel is even, then you're going to want to add that whole stitch on each side for the seaming to make your ribbing match up correctly. But because I had an odd number of stitches on each of my panels, I chose to do the half stitch column in my seam, and that makes the ribbing line up correctly here. So this seam is going to be eventually, once we get to the end of it, it's going to be completely invisible. You will not be able to see it at all. So I'm just going to keep working my mattress stitch seam all the way up to the underarm of the sweater, or the point where the sleeves meet the body panels. So now that I've made it up through the ribbing, I want to make sure that the rest of my rows are lined up as I go further up the panels. So if I hold them up against each other and try to line them up the way they are, the rows on this side tend to be a little bit lower than the ones on this side. So I'm going to only take 1 horizontal strand from the side that is lower, and then take the 2 from the side that is higher, and see if they match up. And they're getting closer now, but there's still just a little bit of difference there. So I'm again going to take the next single horizontal strand on the shorter side or the lower side, and then the next 2 strands on the other side. And that will help ensure that my stripes line up, and that when I get to the stopping point of my seam or at the underarm, then I will end up, you know, with the 2 sides meeting up correctly and lining up, and the point where the sleeve meets the body of the sweater will line up on both sides, as opposed to one being higher than the other. So as I continue up the panels to stitch them together, I can now take 2 strands from each side as I take each stitch. And again, those are the horizontal strands that run in between the stitch columns that we are working in between. And now you can see, if I just take 1 more stitch, you can see how evenly and seamlessly my stripe here lines up without having any kind of difference in the two panels coming together. It's just totally seamless and invisible, and the stripes line up perfectly. So I'm going to continue stitching my way up the side seam of the sweater, taking 2 strands on each side until I get to the underarm where the sleeve meets the body of the sweater on both sides. Alright, so I have made it to the top of my seam here. This is the point where the sleeve is going to come together. And before you finish your seam off, you just want to give it a good lengthwise stretch to make sure that it is not pulled too tight vertically. And then I'm going to turn it to the inside just a little bit, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a tug just to close up that very top part of that seam. And then I'm going to take a stitch into the seam allowance and make a knot. And the seam allowance is just the little edges of the seam that get turned to the inside when you mattress stitch. So now I'm going to go ahead and weave in this tail. Alright, so there is the first part of our side seam all sewn up. It's totally invisible because we lined up those stripes correctly when we got started. So now I'm going to do the same thing starting from the sleeve cuff. So we're going to be stitching the 2 sides of the sleeve together, and this is wider than it looks. It looks really, really narrow because it's so curled up, but once we sew it together, it's going to be kind of like that. And this is a pretty small sweater anyway. But we're going to do basically the exact same thing we just did, starting at the hem of the sweater, except we're going to start at the sleeve cuff and work our way back to the underarm where that we just tied off. And I'm going to do this with the yarn tail from my cast on from the sleeve. Alright, so I've made it down to the very, very tiny point where the pieces come together. And I'm going to take that last stitch right in there on that side. And that is the end of our sleeve seam. So now what we're going to do is take the needle to the inside of the work. And again, we're going to tie a knot right here where all these seams intersect. And weave in this tail. I'm going to do the exact same thing to sew the other side together for the sleeve and the side seams, and weave in all remaining ends. So I'm just going to do the side seam on this side, the same as I did the one on the other side, and the sleeve seam on this side, the same as I did the one on the other side, and just weave in all remaining ends, and then our sweater is finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make a sweater on your Addi, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.